Welcome to the Church Leadership Podcast, your weekly source for encouraging and equipping local church leaders, with your hosts, Mark Gainey and Andy Frazier. In each episode, Andy and Mark sit down with church leaders that you should know. We believe these honest conversations will be helpful and encouraging to you as you lead the local church. Here is this week's episode.
Welcome to episode number 72 of the Church Leadership Podcast. We've got a great conversation in store for you today, but before we get there, I want to remind you, you've got 6 days left, only 6 days, to enter our Bribe to Subscribe contest. We're going to give away a new iPad. We are bribing you to subscribe or to get others to subscribe. So go over to our website, churchleadershippodcast.com, click on the top right corner menu tab, Bribe to Subscribe, to find out all the information to enter for a chance to win a new iPad. Now, here's today's conversation.
Welcome to the podcast. We're so glad you've joined us today. Today, we have a special guest with us. Trevin Wax has joined us on the podcast today. Trevin, thank you for being with us today on the Church Leadership Podcast.
I'm glad to be with you guys. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And as we talk, it starts raining hard here. I don't know if you can hear that rain.
Yeah, it is
pouring
rain.
Yeah, it's been raining here just about every day. Well, Trevin, again, thank you for being on the podcast. And if you don't mind, share a little bit about where God has you and, you know, the role that you're playing now and what he's using you to kind of participate in and how he's using you to lead in LifeWay and other areas too.
Sure. So right now, in just the last few months, I've been serving as a vice president for Theology and Communications, which means I oversee the communications department internally and externally for LifeWay Research. If you've ever seen LifeWay Research studies and things, that team is part of my team. And then LifeWay Leadership, which includes Ministry Grid, and then LifeWay Leadership podcasts and whatnot. And I also oversee a theological community of practice that does some training for marketers and editors all throughout LifeWay, just to make sure that we are staying true to what our confessional guideposts are for LifeWay to make sure that we continue to put out trustworthy resources. So that's a new role. I had served as director for Bibles before that, and then had been brought to LifeWay to start the Gospel Project before that. And so I have a hand in all of those things too.
We are thankful for your work in the Gospel Project. Both of our churches actually utilize the Gospel Project.
Oh, that's great.
Wonderful resource that is for every age to be on the same page kind of thing. We really appreciate that. And
that's been a labor of love. That team is amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing to work with.
Yeah. It's produced a lot of fruit in our ministry. So we're thankful for that. And it sounds like you've got a plate full. You've got a lot going on, and we appreciate you taking the time to be with us here today on the podcast. And we have followed you from a distance for a while, and we're familiar with a lot of your work and what you do. And we're thankful how God has used you and your influence, not just through LifeWay, but just in Christianity, evangelical Christianity in our culture and in our day and age. So we're thankful for that. We wanted to talk about some of those things if you want to go down that road and that rabbit hole for just a few minutes. So
we listen, we have so many questions. We don't have time to ask all the questions that we want to ask, but,
oh boy.
But I figure we'll start with this one. In what you do, and you know, a lot of your blogs and the things you write about are related to this. Obviously, I mean, you would have to be living under a rock to not be aware of the cultural challenges that we face as Christians in our culture, in our context, in America. And so talk a little bit about some of those cultural challenges that you have seen that we face as Christians today.
Well, the church is facing challenges in every generation. And so sometimes I think we have the tendency to think that the challenges that we're facing today are bigger challenges than those faced 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But the church, what I like to remind, whenever we're going to talk about this subject, what I like to remind people of is that the church is always in crisis. Even if you go back all the way back to the early church, heresies coming from within the church, persecution coming from outside the church. But the church is likewise also always stable, because Jesus said, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." So whenever we talk about challenges, you generally are going to find your opportunities clustered around those challenges or as part of those challenges. One of the there's several that immediately come to mind when I think about the church in the West, or in our context. One is just there's a declining trust in institutions. And so it can be challenging to make a case for it, something like church membership. Church attendance may be an easier sell for many people than church membership, but the idea of institutions and faith in institutions declining, that's something that is across the board throughout the United States. Generally, the military is still well respected and well trusted, but after that, most of the institutions have taken a big hit, and churches being one of them. Of course, the sex abuse scandals that have just ravaged through the Catholic Church, and then, I mean, even in some of our own circles, those certainly don't help when it comes to trusting in the power of formation of institutions. So that's one thing that's happened. Another thing is just the dominant worldview for most people in our society is that the purpose of life is to find and express yourself. That, be true to who you are. Find out who you are deep down inside, what you desire the most, run after that with all your might. And that presents both challenge and opportunity. The challenge there being that that can turn your faith or your church attendance or your religious practice into something that's just an add-on to a life that's really all revolving around you and whatever you think that you are deep down inside. You kind of remain in control of who you are. You define yourself, and then other people around you are there to affirm and help you along in that journey of whatever it is that you've decided for yourself. And so the church doesn't get emptied in that situation. It gets full of people who think the church is there to help them do that, to be true to themselves, to be the better self. So that's a challenge. And then, then we certainly have challenges too culturally, because when it comes to our understanding of creation and the fall and morality, particularly sexual morality, we're increasingly the minority, certainly the minority these days. And so that can be a challenge for the church as well, because not only do we have a message that may seem crazy to the world, we also have a morality that increasingly may seem crazy to the world. And that's something that we have to grapple with in the days ahead.
You're speaking a language that maybe some people who are listening to our podcast, that light bulbs are going on. Some things are clicking with them. They're thinking, we do have a lot of people attending our church, and there is a lack of commitment for membership, and membership isn't as meaningful maybe as it has been in the past. Or maybe people are there and they're thinking, wow, all of this stuff, you're doing all this for me. Wow, that's great. I can be on board with a church who's centered around me and my affinities and desires and passions. So I think you're speaking directly to a lot of people who are listening, and it's going to make sense to them. What are some challenges we have in church right now, as far as, I know there's a lot of talk about Generation Z and millennials and how those demographics are greatly affected by the methods we're using to reach people. Obviously, we know that the gospel is timeless, and we want to be effective in our efforts to share the gospel and make disciples. What are some challenges you think, based on the things that you just mentioned, that the average church is going to face?
Well, when I think about, you talked about church membership being one of the things that's been affected. Church attendance has also been affected, just a little bit differently. If you look at the percentage of people who attend church every week today, that consider themselves regular attenders of church today versus other generations, we're really about at the rate that we were in the 1940s. From a percentage of the population that attends, that considers themselves faithful in their attendance to church. What has really changed, though, in the past 15 to 20 years, though, is what the definition of faithful church attender means. So a lot of people have seen attendance drop, not because they've necessarily lost a lot of people, but because people don't come as frequently as they used to. So, someone who's there a couple times a month would be considered a faithful churchgoer. whereas it used to be 2 or 3 times a week was considered a faithful churchgoer, 15 or 20 years ago. So because of that, I think that's one of the challenges, is that we do see a decline in church attendance, which and it can be really challenging, for pastors, for leaders who are doing sermon series, or they're trying to build on teaching, or they really want to build a culture where there's a strong community focus. It can be challenging when people just are not gathering as often. A lot of people see the church as something a little more on the periphery of their life, rather than at the center of their family life. And you see that happen constantly when it comes down to, questions and concerns and priorities when it comes to, ball versus church, or entertainment, or other things. So I think that's one challenge. But you mentioned Gen Z and Generation X, and we certainly also have a challenge, I think, of technology has really complicated things for a lot of parents and a lot of families.
Yep.
I hear a lot from families and from churches who are just not sure how to. The smartphone has really revolutionized so many aspects of life, and that they're concerned about how to monitor the online lives of their kids. They're not, they're concerned about what they could access. And so that sense that you had, where you tried to raise your kids in a good environment at home, good environment at church, be involved with your kids at school, no matter what kind of school, whether it's homeschool or Christian school or public school. That is complicated somewhat by the smartphone and the ability for our kids to just access and have conversations constantly with people from all different sides of, all over the world, even in playing certain games and things. And so I think that's a challenge that we are still figuring out exactly what that looks like, how we will address that. We've seen a lot of anxiety increase among teenagers, among Gen Z. You've seen a lot of, especially among young girls, there's just a level of anxiousness in there that a lot of people are beginning to wonder, seeing the numbers. They can see it seeming to rise with the rise of smartphones, and they wonder, is that leading to needless anxiety that goes beyond what you would have in middle school or high school, just in the social dynamics of that world, because you're never really unplugged from it. Those are questions that are being raised. And I think, again, the church is challenged with that too, because it's our families too. And we're all kind of caught in the maelstrom of that. I think the question
as a father of 2 teenage girls, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. And the way to respond, and the way for the church to come alongside and be a support and a help, and to offer wisdom and guidance in those areas, I think is going to be really important.
Well, and that brings me to the next question, really related to all of that, both, subjects we just talked about, with the cultural shift in the West, with the changing approach that we have to have to ministry, with the rapid technology changes and impact that we all experience, church leaders, church members, pastors, all of us. How do we as Christians, how do we as church leaders respond to all these changes? Because, Trevin, I mean, that there's all kind of typical natural responses, when the culture is changing, when the language of culture is changing, when the worldview is changing, the natural response is to, just to rail against it, to go on a rant on social media or in the pulpit or whatever. And then with all the technology shifting as well, the natural reaction is to run and hide and ignore and deny. So what's the right way to respond to all these cultural changes that we're experiencing as leaders and as churches?
Well, I think it helps us if we can anticipate and expect some of the cultural shifts that we see. I mean, some of them you can see coming, and when they get here, it seems like it shocks and surprises us. But on the one hand, that may be because we've grown used to, or we've gotten accustomed to the culture as it was. And we are a little surprised when the world is acting like the world and following trajectories that the world is going to follow, So I think on the one hand, we shouldn't act fearful or be terribly surprised at what happens in the world because we know things could get a lot worse. There have been
Right.
times throughout history they have been a lot worse. And there are places in the world right now where it's a lot worse for Christians. And so a little perspective goes a long way, I think, in us not simply being reactionary. I mean, we will have hopefully sanctified, God glorifying reactions to certain things that happen in the world. But to be reactionary means we're not actually thinking about our mission moving forward. We're actually, if we're not careful, we can get into this fortress mentality where, if we all just will huddle together and maybe the storm will blow over and we'll all be fine. But that kind of defensive posture, I think, there are times we do need to be defensive, but that kind of defensive posture, I think the concern I always have with that is that it leads us to maintenance over mission, maintaining what we have rather than mission about moving forward. And so I'd encourage people, when you see these cultural challenges coming, it's part of the adventure. I mean, this is the adventure of following Jesus. This is not, we should expect that it's going to be hard at times. We should expect there's going to be a price to pay. We should expect there's going to be at times sacrifice, misunderstanding. Jesus said you'll be mocked or be persecuted. You'll be, there are ways that we can move forward with a kind of faith where we try to carve out for ourselves the freedom, and we want to maintain for ourselves the freedom to be able to live according to our beliefs. I think that is very important for us and for the next generation. But I don't think we do that primarily out of a posture of fear. I think it needs to be more out of the posture of faith, that we have received some really good things in our society that we want to preserve. That's what salt does. It preserves, right? And so I think as Christians, we'd be better off looking around and seeing those opportunities where we might act as the agent of salt, where we're slowing down decay and we are preserving good things in our society at the same time being distinct from the world in how we live.
That's fantastic.
That's spot on, Trevin. That's spot on. Yeah, I think that demeanor that a lot of people have, holding the fort down until Jesus comes back, I think that's antithetical to the mission of the church. I think we're supposed to be influencers in our culture, and I think the gospel power and the Holy Spirit living inside us, I think that those are the things that Jesus foresaw us being able to utilize in fulfilling his mission for us. So
yeah,
so
the only fort that is trying to be held down is Satan's, and the gates.
Yes.
We're charging the gates. That's the vision that Jesus gives of what the mission of the church looks like. That we are actually the ones who are on the move and pushing forward.
That's right.
We're on the offense. And you know what? God is sovereign. And none of this is a surprise to him. And so you said in faith, we trust in the Lord as he uses us as influencers.
Yeah. And God has blessed you in the opportunities you have, the platform you have a wealth of information coming at you probably from all directions. And I'm just curious to know, what do you think the trends are with the information you have at your disposal for the normative sized church? Because that's the majority of the listeners on our podcast, or the 250 and under size churches, and church leaders in those churches are in the trenches. They're trying to do their best to reach their communities, to preach biblical truth and with fidelity, and they're trying to engage and influence the culture. What kind of trends do you see as far as that? Because we're experiencing something with the relationships we have and the friendships we're building, and we're seeing that the normative sized church and even bivocational ministry are kind of on the uptick rather than on the downswing.
Yeah. So the trends I see are not great, but they're not doom and gloom either. They're sometimes I see headlines that are really sensationalistic. Look at this, the decline of Christianity, the rise of the nuns, Christianity is dying in the West and dying in America. And you actually look at the details and the actual statistics, and you realize, no, that's really not, the headlines don't match. So I'd encourage people not to be sensationalistic when they see statistics and trends and whatnot. There is a trending decline in church membership, as there has been a decline in church membership from across, there are not as many people members of a bowling league either. There's membership in general is declining across the country. And church, that's a tough trend, because when it comes to accountability in a congregation, being held spiritually accountable to people, it's harder and harder to do that when you've never seen yourself as accountable to a church in the first place. So that's a trend that presents a challenge and an opportunity for us as we talk about kind of recovering what that looks like. I mentioned the trend on church attendance and whatnot. The trends on secularizing America, America is increasingly non-religious. You might think that trend is happening across the board everywhere, and especially among younger generations. But there's some research that actually shows that there's still a substantial number of 20-somethings even who would consider themselves devout and be evangelical. And even those who would consider themselves to be of no religious affiliation at all, some of them are still quite religious in what they actually will do. And so sometimes those numbers, the complexity of those numbers can get overblown. It is a challenge with young people. Reaching the next generation is a challenge. Every generation has to pass on the faith to the next generation. Right. So that is a trend that we continue to see. There is certainly more of an indifference toward religion among younger people than has been true of previous generations, and may likely continue to be the case, even while there's still a good base of young people. One trend that you may see, and this may be something that affects some of the churches that you're serving or talking to, is young people tend to cluster in congregations. So it can feel like in certain congregations, all the young people have fled or are gone or not coming back to church. But a lot of young people wind up going to church. They just wind up being in much younger congregations. So you see a little bit of a generation gap in congregations as well. And so churches that are figuring out how to grow young instead of grow old and try to really reach out and involve the next generation. Those are trends I see and challenges I think that are going to be across the board for the church in the next decade or so.
That is definitely in line with exactly what we're seeing. That's a great insight. So in the last couple of minutes we have remaining, I'm sure that some people are listening to this and they're like, yep, I've seen those trends. Membership decline, those kind of things. But we also know that the gospel works, and we also know that God is still at work. And so maybe share some things that you've seen where God is working and where the gospel is having headway, even among these cultural challenges.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think there are signs of hope all over the place. I mean, when I think about, different ministries that I've been able to see when it comes to, I've seen thriving college ministries at certain university campuses that are attached to local churches, just thriving college ministries. At the same time, have been encouraged to see lots of churches growing during this time as well. And by conversion, not just because, it's the hot church in town and that's where everyone's going. That's encouraging to see. Some of the pastors that have become well known are those who demonstrate a real confidence in not only in the truth of the gospel, but in the beauty of the gospel. And it comes out in the way that they communicate, that they're not simply delivering truth. They're expressing it as beautifully as possible to show the world just how, just what a precious gift we have, what we treasure when we speak of the gospel of Jesus. So I think there are lots of reasons to be hopeful. Even in bivocational ministry, we're talking about that. I see more and more of that as becoming a normal thing across the country. And there's there are certainly challenges with that, as you know, but there are a lot of opportunities with that too. And especially when you think about that in the United States, but then you think of mission work, missionaries that do similar things. there are all sorts. These challenges provide new opportunities for the church to adjust and adapt some methods and think through some things and re-strategize. And usually what comes out of that after a lot of prayer and a lot of consideration can come some really exciting things that I hope will continue to bear fruit in the future.
Yeah, we tend to hear a lot of bad news, and it's nice to hear good news. And it's easy to turn on the TV or look at our social media news feeds and see all the arguing and infighting, or look at all the bad news. But there are some wonderful things happening.
So true.
And thank you for that encouragement there, to hear that God is at work. And listen, Jesus said he would build his church. And just because we may not see it in our community, it doesn't mean it's not happening across town or across the globe, that people are being added to the church daily. As we even are speaking right now, there's people coming to faith in Christ and being added into kingdom. So I want to ask you, as we close out our time today, do you have any suggestions for any tools or resources that people might be able to get their hands on or click on that might be helpful to deal with some of the things we've talked about today?
Yeah, one of the I hate to just point people to my blog, but I feel like I'm putting resources out there on the blog all the time to just push people in direction when it comes to reading, or when it comes to some different books and things. And so in the last year or so, there's been some really helpful resources that have come out. Statistically, just showing kind of what's happening, trends and whatnot. I was mentioning some research on 20-somethings. I did a review of a book called The 20-Something Soul, which was helpful for me to just get a better understanding of what's underneath some of those stats that you see constantly, and to realize, there's some troubling trends here, but there's also some really encouraging things that are going on, and to be able to pull that out and to read some of that. So I'm constantly on the blog. I'm trying to point people in the direction of some resources that will hopefully be helpful as people are.
Hey, I don't mind giving you a shameless plug. You're a great curator, especially your Trevin 7. That's been a very, very helpful thing to me personally and to my ministry. So
I'm glad to hear that. I love doing that. There's just so much stuff that's good out there. I'm trying to just pass it on when I find it.
Yeah, we'll definitely put the link to your blog in the show notes too. Certainly. Well, Trevin, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us and sharing some insight and some of your experience. And we appreciate you being on the podcast.
Glad to do it. Thanks, guys.
Well, we know those who've listened today have been better encouraged and even better equipped to lead in the local church. And we thank you for the time that you've given us to listen to today's podcast. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Church Leadership Podcast. Don't forget to share, subscribe, and even review our podcast on your favorite podcast listening app.